He almost threw it into the fire. One more faded envelope. One more forgotten piece of a war that had already stolen too much. But then he noticed a single line written across the front in careful handwriting, and his hand stopped before the flame ever reached the paper. It wasn't a military order. It wasn't a coded message. It was a mother's promise that had never reached the son she prayed would come home. What could possibly be written inside a letter powerful enough to make an American soldier disobey his own orders? And why, decades later, would that forgotten envelope still be remembered by everyone who witnessed what happened next? Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper stood in the doorway of the abandoned municipal office while the afternoon light filtered through cracked windows coated with months of dust. His unit had been instructed to collect documents, separate anything with intelligence value, and destroy the rest before moving on. The work had become routine. Stacks of papers disappeared into metal barrels every day, curling into gray ash that drifted silently across empty streets. Daniel reached into another weathered cabinet, whose drawers barely opened after years of neglect. Most of what he found was exactly what he expected: ration forms, faded receipts, school records, government notices already made meaningless by a collapsing nation. Then, buried beneath a bundle of official files tied together with brittle string, he discovered the envelope. Its edges were soft from handling. The seal had never been broken. A pressed wildflower rested inside the fold, flattened so carefully that even after months it had held its shape. Across the front, written in graceful German script, was a name followed by only one word Daniel immediately recognized from the translator assigned to his company. Son. He stared at the envelope longer than he intended. Somewhere, someone had waited for these words. Somewhere, a mother had believed they would be read. Around him, soldiers continued sorting papers without looking twice. To everyone else, it was only another forgotten letter. To Daniel, it suddenly felt far too heavy to disappear into smoke. Daniel turned the envelope over in his hands without opening it. The paper felt surprisingly solid, as though someone had chosen every fold with care, believing it would survive the journey across a continent. His thumb rested against the unbroken seal while distant truck engines rumbled somewhere beyond the empty street. Around him, another bundle of documents disappeared into the burned barrel. The flames rose, settled, and quietly consumed names, signatures, and histories that no one expected to read again. Harper, one of the corporals, called from across the room. Anything useful over there? Daniel glanced at the envelope once more before slipping it carefully into the inside pocket of his field jacket. Nothing important, he answered, surprised by how easily the words left his mouth. It was the first time in months that he had deliberately kept something off the official inventory. The decision lingered in his thoughts as the squad finished loading the trucks. Regulations existed for good reasons. Every document was supposed to be examined, cataloged, or destroyed. Personal belongings were not trophies. Private correspondence belonged to procedures, not individual judgment. Yet something about the careful handwriting refused to become another anonymous record. That evening, after the day's assignments were complete, Daniel sat alone outside a temporary supply building while the fading sunlight stretched across broken rooftops in long bands of gold. The air carried the scent of damp earth after a brief spring shower, and somewhere nearby, a church bell still marked the hour despite missing half its tower. He removed the envelope once again, studying the graceful script that seemed almost untouched by the chaos surrounding it. Slowly, almost apologetically, he eased a pocket knife beneath the edge of the old seal, taking care not to tear the fragile paper. A single folded sheet slipped into his hands. Before reading another word, he noticed one small detail that caught him completely off guard. The letter began not with fear, not with anger, but with gratitude. Daniel lowered the page for a moment and looked across the silent street, as though the words had carried him somewhere far beyond the shattered buildings surrounding him. The handwriting was steady, elegant, and patient. Every sentence had been written by someone who believed ordinary life would return. The woman introduced herself simply as Anna Weiss. She did not write about politics. She did not speak about victory or defeat. Instead, she thanked her son for fixing the old kitchen window before he left home because the spring rain no longer leaked onto the family table. She told him that the apple tree behind their cottage had begun to bloom again after surviving another cold winter. She apologized because she could not send the small loaf of bread she had promised. Flour had become impossible to find, but she had dried herbs from the garden instead, hoping their scent would remind him of home. Daniel continued reading in complete silence. Every line sounded strangely familiar. Anna worried that her son was skipping meals because he had always done that as a boy whenever he became too busy. She reminded him to keep his feet dry whenever it rained because he used to catch colds so easily after fishing in the creek near their village. She ended one paragraph with a sentence that made Daniel stop breathing for just a second. She wrote that every mother, no matter what language she spoke, counted the days by waiting for footsteps to return to the front door. Daniel closed his eyes. He could almost hear his own mother in Ohio saying the very same thing before he boarded the train nearly 2 years earlier. The words were different, but the love behind them was identical. For the first time since arriving in Europe, the faces of friend and enemy no longer stood on opposite sides of his thoughts. They stood beneath the same porch light, waiting for the same impossible knock at the door. Daniel folded the letter with the same care Anna had used when she first wrote it, smoothing the crease with the palm of his hand before placing it back inside the worn envelope. The camp around him settled into its familiar evening rhythm. Tin cups clinked softly against wooden tables. A mechanic laughed somewhere behind a row of supply trucks. Someone tuned a radio that faded in and out beneath the breeze. Life moved forward exactly as it had the day before, yet something inside Daniel had shifted in a way he could not explain. Before sunrise the next morning, the company received orders to relocate several miles east. Men packed crates, rolled blankets, and secured equipment with practiced efficiency. Daniel reached for his field jacket, felt the envelope resting safely in the inner pocket, and paused. He could have left it behind with the rest of the discarded papers. No one would ever know. Instead, he buttoned the jacket closed as though protecting something far more valuable than paper. During the drive, the convoy passed villages where chimneys still stood beside houses that no longer had roofs. Laundry fluttered from a single clothesline stretched between two surviving fence posts. An elderly man repaired a bicycle wheel outside a workshop with shattered windows. Two children chased one another across a narrow lane, their laughter floating above the steady sound of truck engines. Daniel watched them disappear in the side mirror and found himself wondering how many mothers had stood in those same doorways waiting for letters that never arrived. When the convoy stopped near a crossroads for fuel and directions, Daniel unfolded a military map across the hood of a Jeep. His eyes searched almost without thinking. Near the bottom corner of the envelope was a return address written in smaller script than the recipient's name. It matched a tiny village marked only by a church symbol and a narrow country road less than 12 miles from their present position. He stared at the map for several long seconds before quietly folding it again. For the first time since opening the envelope, he realized the journey described by those handwritten words might not be over after all. Daniel waited until the fuel trucks pulled away before making his decision. He walked toward Lieutenant Robert Ellis, who was studying the route for the afternoon advance, and pointed to the small village on the folded map. "Permission to check this road for possible civilian activity," Daniel said evenly. The lieutenant looked at him for a moment, then followed the line of Daniel's finger. "You have 30 minutes, he replied. "Take the Jeep. Stay clear of unnecessary trouble. We move on schedule." Daniel nodded, offering no further explanation. Some reasons were easier to carry than to speak aloud. The narrow country road curved through open fields where fresh spring grass had begun covering the scars of a long winter. White clouds drifted across a pale blue sky, casting slow-moving shadows over orchards just beginning to bloom. Farmhouses appeared one by one, quiet and weathered, their gardens showing the first signs of new vegetables pushing through the soil. The world looked strangely determined to become ordinary again. Daniel stopped several times, asking elderly villagers in slow, careful words if they knew the Weiss family. Some shook their heads politely. Others simply pointed farther down the road. An old carpenter repairing a wooden gate finally paused, removed his cap, and lifted one weathered hand toward a cottage standing alone beyond a line of apple trees. "Anna," he said softly in accented English. "She still waits." The words settled heavily in the silence. Daniel thanked the man and continued alone. As the Jeep rolled closer, he noticed a small porch swept clean despite its age. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows, filled with tiny white blossoms that had survived the early spring frost. A pair of worn shoes stood neatly beside the front door as though someone expected a visitor at any moment. Daniel switched off the engine. The sudden quiet allowed him to hear birds singing somewhere beyond the orchard. He reached into his jacket and touched the envelope once more. It no longer felt like evidence from a forgotten war. It felt like a promise that had traveled hundreds of miles searching for the only person who had never stopped believing it would someday come home. Daniel stepped out of the Jeep, but remained beside the gate for a long moment, allowing the silence to settle before he took another step. The cottage looked modest, yet every detail reflected quiet care. The porch had been swept that morning. A watering can rested beside the flower boxes. Fresh bread cooled beneath a folded linen cloth on the windowsill. Whoever lived here had refused to surrender ordinary life, even when the world around her had forgotten how to be ordinary. He walked slowly to the front door and knocked gently. No answer came at first. After several seconds, the sound of careful footsteps crossed the wooden floor inside. The door opened only a few inches. A woman with silver beginning to thread through her light brown hair looked at him with calm, searching eyes. She stood straight despite the years written softly across her face. Daniel removed his cap before saying a single word. Neither of them spoke the other's language well enough for easy conversation. Instead, he reached into his jacket and held out the weathered envelope with both hands. The moment her eyes found the familiar handwriting, time seemed to stop. She did not reach for it immediately. She simply stared, one hand rising slowly to cover her mouth as though she no longer trusted her own breath. Finally, with remarkable gentleness, she accepted the letter, tracing the ink with trembling fingertips. Tears gathered in her eyes, but none fell. She recognized every curve of her own handwriting because she had written those words months earlier with hope instead of certainty. She looked back at Daniel, searching for an explanation he could not fully give. He quietly touched his heart, then pointed to the envelope before lowering his eyes in respect. Nothing else was necessary. Anna understood. The letter had been found. It had been protected, and a stranger wearing the uniform she had every reason to fear had chosen kindness instead of convenience. For several long seconds, they simply stood there in complete silence, united by something far greater than the languages they could not speak. Anna finally broke the silence with a quiet invitation, stepping aside and gently motioning toward the small kitchen. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before accepting. The room carried the comforting scent of chamomile and fresh bread, untouched by ceremony, yet filled with the kind of warmth that no army could manufacture. A kettle rested on a cast-iron stove, and family photographs stood carefully arranged on a narrow wooden shelf. Anna placed the unopened letter on the table before pouring 2 cups of tea. She did not rush to read it. Somehow, after waiting so long, another few minutes no longer mattered. Daniel noticed a framed photograph beside the window. A young man stood smiling between 2 apple trees, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, one hand resting on a ladder leaning against the same cottage that still stood outside. Anna followed his eyes and gently touched the frame. Then she pointed first to the young man, then to the letter, and finally to her own heart. No translation was needed. Daniel nodded quietly. Anna unfolded the letter with extraordinary care, as though each crease deserved gratitude. Her eyes moved slowly across every line. At times a faint smile appeared. At other moments she paused, pressing her fingertips lightly against the page before continuing. She laughed softly when she reached the passage about the repaired kitchen window, glancing instinctively toward the very window that remained perfectly sealed. Then her smile faded into peaceful reflection as she reached the final sentence she had written months before. She closed her eyes and held the paper against her chest for several long breaths. When she looked back at Daniel, she rose from her chair, crossed the small room, and opened a drawer near the stove. From inside, she removed another envelope, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. She placed it gently into Daniel's hands and pointed across the Atlantic with a small gesture toward the west. On the front, written in careful English, were the words, "To the mother of the soldier who someday brings kindness back into this house." Daniel looked at the envelope in his hands as though it weighed far more than a single sheet of paper. He glanced up at Anna with quiet confusion. She smiled gently and placed one hand over her heart before pointing once more toward him, then toward the distant horizon beyond the cottage windows. The message was simple enough to understand without perfect words. She believed kindness should never stop where it first appeared. Daniel accepted the envelope with both hands, giving a slight nod that carried more gratitude than any speech could have expressed. Before he left, Anna walked to the garden and carefully picked a small white apple blossom from the nearest branch. She tucked it inside the fold of the envelope just as she had once placed a pressed wildflower inside the letter meant for her son. It was a silent tradition, passed from one hopeful heart to another. Outside, the afternoon sun settled warmly across the orchard. Daniel paused beside the jeep and looked back once. Anna remained standing on the porch, not waving, not calling after him, simply watching with the calm dignity of someone who had learned that the deepest moments in life rarely needed words. The drive back to his company felt different from the journey that had brought him there. The same narrow road stretched ahead. The same farms lined the hillsides. Yet every mile seemed lighter. When he reached the temporary command post, Lieutenant Ellis noticed the unusual expression on Daniel's face, but asked no questions. Some stories announced themselves without explanation. That evening, after finishing his duties, Daniel sat beneath a lantern and began writing to his own mother in Ohio. He told her nothing about military assignments or long roads or abandoned buildings. Instead, he wrote about a small cottage surrounded by apple trees, about a mother whose hope had survived longer than anyone expected, and about the quiet truth he had only now begun to understand. Wars could separate nations, but they had never found a way to teach mothers to love their children differently. Several weeks later, the envelope addressed to Daniel's mother finally crossed the Atlantic inside his carefully packed belongings. When he returned to Ohio after the war, he placed it on the kitchen table before saying anything else. His mother looked at the unfamiliar handwriting, then at the pressed apple blossom tucked safely inside. She opened the letter slowly. Anna had written in simple English, choosing each word with remarkable care. She thanked the woman she had never met for raising a son who remembered that compassion did not belong to one nation alone. She wrote that there had been a morning when she believed the world had forgotten her family forever, until a young American soldier appeared at her door carrying not victory, not judgment, but a promise that should have arrived months before. Daniel watched his mother's eyes fill with quiet tears. When she finished reading, she folded the letter exactly as Anna had folded her own and placed it beside the family Bible where important memories were kept. Years passed. The apple blossom dried with age but never crumbled. Whenever neighbors asked Daniel about the most unforgettable moment of his service, they expected stories about uniforms, medals, or famous places. Instead, he always spoke about a small cottage surrounded by apple trees and two mothers who would never meet, yet somehow understood each other completely. He never claimed that one letter changed history. It did not end a war or rewrite the past, but it changed one man's understanding of the people living on the other side of a battlefield, and sometimes that is where lasting peace quietly begins. Long after the roads had been rebuilt and the seasons had covered old scars with new grass, the memory remained untouched. Because the greatest acts of courage are not always the ones witnessed by crowds. Sometimes they begin with a hand that chooses not to let a single letter become ashes. She did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.